Today's game features Mikhail Tal playing as white against Eldar Kamilyevich Mukhametov as black. Move 1. White pushes the pawn to c4. Following classical principles, black responds with supports the center with c6. Activating the pieces, white advances the pawn, developing with tempo. Black occupies the center with the pawn. This is the English, Caro-Kann defensive system. We're at move 5. White repositions the knight to f3, improving minor piece coordination. Meanwhile, knight hops to f6. At this point, white maneuvers the knight to c3. Black responds with repositions the bishop. White knight eliminates the pawn. Black castles short. White plays knight to d3. Black bishop takes the knight. White pawn takes bishop. Black knight captures the pawn on e4, building the initiative. We're at move 15. White activates the bishop early. Black advances the pawn to d5. Moving forward, white pawn takes the pawn, creating a solid foundation. And here, queen eliminates the pawn. White continues with castles on the king side. Black develops the bishop naturally. It's white's turn. Finds a stronger diagonal. Now, queen joins the attack. White rook to e1. Black reroutes the knight to d7. We're at move 25. White deploys the bishop to f1, improving the position. It's black's turn. Queen shifts to d5. White responds with maneuvers the knight to f4. So, black queen captures the queen on d1. Next, white rook takes queen, winning material. Building a decisive advantage. It's black's turn. Places the knight on f6. Dominating the center. White pushes the pawn to f3. A modest advantage. Black brings the rook to e8. The evaluation changes here. White continues with pawn to g4. Black bishop slides to e6. On move 35, white knight snaps off the bishop. Interestingly, pawn takes knight on e6. Seizing the advantage. White now plays pushes to c4. Black maneuvers the knight to f8. White now plays doubles rooks on the file. This improves the position significantly. Black deploys the rook to e7. A solid positional move. White continues with moves the rook to d1. Black rook swings to d7. The win is within reach. At this point, rook takes rook on d7. Black knight takes rook. On move 45, white pushes the passed pawn to f4. Demonstrating technique. Black the king becomes active. White develops the bishop to g2. Black pushes the passed pawn to a6. White cuts off the enemy king with the rook. Black rook moves behind the passed pawn, trading into a winning endgame. White cuts off the enemy king with the rook. Black rook to c7. The advantage becomes clear. Next, white advances the pawn, missing the best continuation. Meanwhile, knight to f6. On move 55, white pawn to g5. Meanwhile, maneuvers the knight to e8. White places the bishop on b6. The technique wins the day. Moving forward, slides the rook to d7. White deploys the rook to f3. Black continues with rook swings to d1, check. The king must move. Moving forward, activates the king becomes active. Meanwhile, black moves the rook to d2, and that's check. So, king moves to g3, the position is unclear. Black takes the pawn with the pawn. We're at move 65. White rook captures pawn, moving closer to victory. Check. Black king enters the battle. White plays rook shifts to f2. Black now plays rook takes the rook. White bishop removes the rook. Black brings the king forward. White continues with king steps to g4. At this point, black maneuvers the knight to d7. White continues with moves the king. Black responds with maneuvers the knight to c7. On move 75, white pushes to h4. Black develops the knight to e6, discovering check. So, white king steps to e4. Black knight jumps to c5, check. White bishop eliminates the knight. Black knight removes the bishop, and check, forcing a response. The path to victory is clear. White centralizes the king. Meanwhile, repositions the knight to e6. With check, pushing for the win, white brings the king forward. Black responds with steps the king to e7. On move 85, white develops the bishop to h3. Black brings the knight to d8. Continuing, white advances the critical pawn. Black activates the knight, with check. Demonstrating endgame mastery, white activates the king. Now, places the knight on d8. White pushes the pawn to b4. Black continues with maneuvers the knight to f7, a model endgame performance. And here, white develops the bishop to f5. Black pushes forward to g6. Move 95. White bishop slides to c8. Black knight hops to d8. White king marches up the board. Black brings the king forward, bringing home the point. Continuing, activates the king. Black activates the king. It's white's turn. Brings the king forward. Black knight jumps to e6. White responds with bishop takes pawn. Black maneuvers the knight to d4. We're at move 105. White king moves to a5. Black continues with king to d7. It's white's turn. Steps the king to b6. Eldar Kamilyevich Mukhametov resigns. Mikhail Tal wins the game.